the aftermath of obsolescence, or the consequences of obsolescence. We've told a story of the file cutters, a craft where steel files are cut by hand with hammer and chisel. Our ancestors followed the trade for at least 3 generations, probably more. Our first ancestors in America, the brothers Richard Alfred and John Forrest Horner, brought their skills at the trade with them as they moved from Yorkshire to the United States during Civil War days. Machines to cut files were being perfected even as they made their move. From the time the first machines appeared, the file cutters, fearing for their futures, argued the mechanically produced files would never be as good as they could cut by hand. And that, of course, was wishful thinking. The human ability to avoid hard truth is amazing. In spite of the ominous truth that the new machines would render their skills irrelevant, our forefathers continued their trade. They must have been very skilled to maintain the Horner brothers' business of file making as long as they did. The handwriting on the wall, though, must have been quite clear, as they apparently began to steer their sons away from their father's trade. By 1885, the machines had won. The files produced mechanically were not only superior, they were cheaper. The file cutter business was done. No more would men practice that trade. They could not compete against the machines. Buggy whips, often cited as being the ultimate example of an obsolete product, are still being made today for horse shows and the Amish. But no one in the whole world is cutting steel files by hand with hammer and chisel. As a going business, Horner Brothers file makers certainly had to end worthless. In 1885, John Forrest Horner gave up. He was 54 years old and was the only support for a growing second family. He desperately needed a source of income. And for whatever reason, he decided to become a farmer, an occupation for which it appears he had absolutely no experience. To compound the problem, John decided to buy a farm in Juneau County, Wisconsin, one of the poorer places in the Midwest to practice agriculture. I suspect it was chosen because of aggressive marketing of their real estate by the railroad. It was on that farm John and second wife Martha raised his second family, and where he lived for more than 20 years until he died in 1908 at the age of 77. He must have had some success at farming to have survived that long. Also in 1885, Richard Alfred, age 57, claimed to still be a file cutter, but he added that now he was also a machinist. He also may have been in poor health, and we are not sure how he and Harriet were able to support themselves and maintain the home at 1212 9th Street. He must have been able to accumulate a nest egg during his working days. 6 years later, in 1891, age 63, my namesake, Richard Alfred Horner, dies. His wife Harriet lives on in their home on 9th Street for 11 more years. Son Francis and daughter Hattie live with her for some of those years and are employed and help support their aging mother. For many years, the Horner men have followed the family trade of file cutting. Is there a consequence to obsolescence? Now the sons' lives are not so certain as the generations preceding. Is there some psychic detachment from a lifestyle of ancestors? I am struck by the stories of these children of Richard and John. The daughters, with the exception of feeble-minded Ellen, seem to do all right. Richard's Hattie marries, raises 3 children, is widowed, but has a stable second marriage. John's Susan, or Susanna, marries into the Gunther family, which shortly achieves a degree of affluence, and her marriage is also stable. The sons have a more checkered record. Richard's Alfred, my great-grandfather, is divorced from first wife Emma. Second marriage to Margaret seems stable, but he never achieves financial security. Alfred changes jobs and residences many times. He never owns a home or an automobile, and he ends his life on welfare. John's son by first wife Mary, born in Yorkshire and named John Jr., who was steered into basket making early in life, stays on in Racine and raises a family in what appears to be a solid situation. But second son, John's Alfred, also born in Yorkshire of Mary, starts out as file cutter, switches finally to basket making, and after a rather brief marriage, the marriage ends in divorce. He pulls up his Wisconsin stakes, moves cross-country to Tacoma, Washington, and this Alfred works the rest of his life at menial jobs. John's second family, by Martha, with one exception, has an almost sad history. The exception is the youngest son, Walter, born when his father John was 64 years old. When the Juneau County farm is sold about 1915, Walter has a brief adventure working on a farm in Oregon, but shortly moves back to Wisconsin to Kenosha, goes to work for Nash Motors, marries, and appears to live a stable life. But the story of the other 4 children is less than storybook. Feeble-minded Ellen is sent off to a state institution when the farm is sold, a situation she survives for less than 10 years. Before that, a son is born to a young lady living on the farm adjacent to the John Forrest Horners in 1903. He is named Paul R. Horner. His mother is Hattie Carey, unmarried daughter of the neighboring farm family. The father is listed as an unknown Horner. Soon, John and Martha's son Edmund moves to Roscoe, Illinois, where he takes up life as a farmhand. I suspect he is the likely sperm donor in this situation, but there are no indications he assumes any of the responsibilities of fatherhood. Before long, down in Roscoe, he does marry Dora, fathers a couple of children by her, before they divorce. Edmund goes from job to job: farmer, painter, handyman, paper hanger. He does, however, take in his widowed mother, Martha, before her death in 1926. John's son, Richard, goes west after the sale of the farm. The paper trail seems to indicate that he is wedded to Clara in Deschutes, Oregon, fathers a couple of children, divorces Clara, and moves to Los Angeles. Interestingly, when he registers for the World War I draft in California, he lists the person to notify in case of emergency as Clara. But Clara is in Oregon, where Richard's brother Irving is a boarder at her house. And shortly, Irving marries Clara, and he fathers 2 more children for her. But then they divorce, and Clara, who was born and raised in Texas, has married enough Horner brothers, and she moves to a suburb of far-off Portland, while Irving continues in Bend, working as a teamster, a logger, and then a plumber. As a teenager, I remember my father stating how blessed our family had been. No divorces, he observed, although he knew his grandfather Alfred had been divorced. I am confident that he did not know of the record of his second cousins, the sons of his great-grandfather's brother, John Forrest Horner. I don't think he had ever heard of this branch of the family, and now I wonder why he or the rest of us never knew of them. Probably because John moved a couple 100 miles away when my grandfather Howard was only 2 years old, and Howard's father Alfred never talked about his Uncle John, who lived a couple 100 miles away. But what I also ponder is this. Did the obsolescence of the family trade play a part in this history of restlessness? Was the disconnect from the family's traditional occupation a factor that disrupted these lives? Or are they really disrupted and unsettled? Seems that it might be that way to this old man, set in his ways. But perhaps I am wrong. Maybe the lives of these men was normal and successful in the context of the society in which they lived. I'll let you decide that for yourself. Had the family remained in England, bound in tradition, would the result have been the same kind of instability? We don't know. What we do know is that all 5 of Alfred's children all lived in stable marriages and lived productive lifestyles.